Maddox. I'm your biggest fan.
For over 20 years, I've run one of the longest-running humor sites on the internet. I've published books, worked on TV shows, and even video games. Along the way, I've met thousands of fans. Most of them have been awesome, but some, unfortunately, have become obsessed and tried to get into my personal life. This is the story of what happens when fans become stalkers.
Maddox and that.
Oh, Maddox is Maddox.
The final episode of the podcast was recorded the weekend of May 28th, 2016. I told him we were recording that weekend, but he wanted to reschedule the show for yet another vacation, this time to Mexico. The week we were set to record is when I caught him lying and talking behind my back. My goal was to end communication with him as quickly as possible, so I offered to let him step down or to end the podcast to avoid any further contact. Not because I needed his approval to make a decision about my podcast, but because I wanted to move on as quickly as possible. He chose to end it, so we recorded as scheduled, and he still didn't show up even after he decided it would be the final episode. He of course played the victim and pretended like he didn't know, but here's the proof he was told when we were recording. In the final episode, I thanked everyone involved with the show, but not him, because I wasn't about to thank him for not giving enough of a shit to come into the final episode, or his unprofessionalism, lying, talking behind my back, laziness, and not disclosing income. And since he made it clear his goal was to use me for attention, I decided right then and there to never mention him again. And for the most part, I haven't. In order for you to understand why, we first need to discuss the animal rights group, PETA. You'll see why in a moment. I used to criticize PETA on my website for their over-the-top campaigns to promote vegetarianism, from downplaying the Holocaust with their Holocaust on a Plate campaign, to dressing up as Klan members to hand out pamphlets, to mocking fat people, and even promoting the discredited theory that milk causes autism. PETA was irresponsible, reckless, and possibly causing harm with their marketing. It wasn't until one day I received an email from a vegetarian who told me that she was also disgusted by PETA. She said PETA's campaigns were outlandish not to be persuasive, but rather to be a spectacle to give them free publicity. It didn't occur to me that maybe their campaigns were over the top because that was the point, to get people to talk about them. PETA seems to have engineered their marketing campaign to manipulate people into giving them free publicity. It's a nod to the old adage of all publicity is good publicity. So I decided that day to never talk about PETA again. And with very few exceptions outside of this video, I haven't. I choose not to reward companies and people who exhibit manipulative behavior to get attention. So when it became clear that Fanboy was using me for money and attention, in his own words, I decided not to talk about him ever again. That was one of the big reasons I stayed silent for so long. For 3 years, from 2016 to 2019, not one tweet, not one mention on my podcast, not one Reddit post. With very few exceptions outside of this video, I've rarely talked about this in public. This drove him crazy. Because remember, he thinks being ignored is worse than being hated. So he tried to provoke me into giving him attention with stalking, fraud, harassment, blackmail, theft, and even extortion. For example, when he harassed my neighbor, she asked him to leave me alone, and he said he would under the condition that she called into his podcast. Extortion is forcing somebody to provide money, goods, or services to avoid harm or harassment. He also threatened to reveal private or embarrassing details if the behavior of me and my then girlfriend, quote, displeases him. That's blackmail. He also did the same to one of my close friends and colleagues, threatening to reveal private sexual details. So, more blackmail. But that failed to get a public response out of me, and since he was desperate to get a response out of me so he'd have something to talk about, he started encouraging people to contact me in private and send him screenshots of our conversations. The only problem is, many of these were doctored or fake, but it didn't matter because he and his hate mob would treat them as if they're real. In fact, at one point after encouraging people to send private conversations, he said he would punish me for it.
If Maddox wants to talk with private conversations with fans, I'm counting that as fucking public. I'm gonna tell the whole fucking story as punishment because he's a fucking dog, and when a dog misbehaves, you hit it.
You know how you punish a dog when it misbehaves, you hit it. That sounds like something they would cut from a movie like American Psycho for being too on the nose. Now you can see some of the context for my silence, but I didn't explain this in public at the time. I could have come out and told people that he was a scumbag, but what's the point? Only about 30% of my fans even knew I had a podcast. Plus, I wanted no further communication, so I thought it would be best to simply close this chapter of my life and move on. You know, like normal people do, instead of becoming an obsessed stalker for over half a decade.
Maddox.
The only thing I said publicly at the time was that it was time that we worked on different projects, which is the only honest thing I could have said without slinging any mud. I had no interest in dragging anyone, in part because there was nothing I could do or say that would make him any more miserable than he's already made himself. I've never met an alcoholic who was happy, and he's no exception. So when I decided to move on, that's exactly what I did. I started a new podcast and never mentioned him on it ever again. Not one time in over 3 years and 141 episodes. In fact, as much as Fanboy copies me, we couldn't be more different. Since ending the podcast, I wrote a new book, wrote my first video game, started a live news program, made a podcast network, started working on a game of my own, learned 3D modeling, started doing character streams on Twitch, and created an animated TV show that I haven't even announced yet. In short, I've been working constantly and living my life. He, on the other hand, has obsessed over me, lurking in the shadows, watching everything I do and trying to sabotage it like a jealous ex. So, understandably, I didn't say anything because I didn't want to give the stalker attention. But there was another reason I stayed quiet that I never told the public before. The week leading up to my podcast ending was one of the worst weeks of my life. And not because of the podcast ending, that didn't even make the top 5 bad things that happened that week. I've never told in public what I'm about to say, in part because it's too personal. And in part because sometimes people use tragedy to gain sympathy. I not only didn't want anyone's sympathy, I wanted to avoid even the possibility of giving that perception. I'm only sharing it now to give you full context since I'm finally telling the story for the first time. The week leading up to my podcast ending, my dad had a stroke. He has since passed away, but it was a very tough time for everyone in my family. And because there's no bottom to how awful this stalker and his hate mob is, they even found my father's grave and attacked me using my father's death. Then the day we were recording, my girlfriend at the time had a series of personal tragic losses requiring my care and attention. Then just as that happened, a friend of mine at the time received news that a person close to him was threatening suicide. All of this happened just as we were about to record. I had no capacity or interest in explaining any of this to the public. There was so much sadness in the room that day, it was a miracle that we were able to record anything at all, let alone manage to make it somewhat funny and entertaining. I didn't want to record, but everyone decided it would be best to get it over with, so we pushed on. And all of that happened on top of all the scummy shit that Fanboy did behind my back that I didn't even mention. Sometimes the comedy people bring you comes at a great personal cost to them. Nobody owes you free entertainment. You aren't entitled to know the private details of the lives of the entertainers you enjoy. They shouldn't have to explain these things to you, so you'll leave them the fuck alone. But that didn't stop some of the entitled, belligerent, dipshit fans from making judgment calls and going on the attack. My silence gave the impression that I was guilty of something, and Fanboy exploited every opportunity to whip up these suggestible idiots into a frenzy. And some of them took Fanboy's lead to dox, stalk, and harass on his behalf. Your only job as a fan, if you like something, is to say thank you. Nobody owes you anything. And if you don't like it, your only other option is to fuck off. I've learned that it's impossible to take the high road with a stalker as obsessed as Fanboy. Staying silent doesn't work, and now you can point to my life for the last 5 years as definitive proof that the old adage of don't feed the trolls is bullshit. Another reason I didn't explain things is because there were a lot of other people involved who fucked up behind the scenes and I didn't want to drag them. But I'm done taking the fall for people who won't own their mistakes. So if they won't clean up their mess, I will. Enough is enough with this bullshit, so it's time to put this nonsense to rest, and you bet your ass I've got receipts. First and foremost is my ex-manager, Randy Kiyan. Randy made one giant fuck up after another, leading to the show's demise. But the worst by far was regarding the iTunes feed. Since most people watching don't even know or care what that is, I've written a separate article from this video with the details for anyone who's interested. But the short version is that a feed is basically a web URL that directs people to a podcast. Randy's job after the podcast ended was to communicate between me and Fanboy about transferring the feed. He told me Fanboy didn't care about the transfer and his only concern was the credit card number and billing address on file. So I changed it and sent Randy an email to confirm, and here's the proof. After I started the transfer process, Randy called me in a panic saying that he miscommunicated. Maybe Fanboy changed his mind and asked him to lie, or maybe he was telling the truth and he really did miscommunicate, but either way, Fanboy used it as an opportunity to lie and claim I stole it.
Because I'm a liar.
This was a huge fuck up on Randy's part because his entire job is to communicate. Although to his credit, he did make a public statement admitting to his mistake, but it came after months and it was too little, too late. Then Fanboy lied and said I put him up to it, but Randy didn't come clean and set the record straight, so again, I got the blame for his mistake. I haven't told what happened until now because I didn't want to get him in trouble, but that ship has sailed and I'm finally setting the record straight. It's been 5 long years and he still hasn't cleaned up his mess, so I'm gonna do it for him. If you want the full story, it's in the article below.